The sun was setting over the dusty plains of Arizona, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. The air carried the faint scent of sagebrush and dry earth as a lone figure rode his horse along the winding trail. It was a boy, no older than 12, with unruly brown hair that stuck out from beneath his worn hat. His face bore the dust of many miles, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion etched into his features. It was something deeper, something heavier that weighed on him like an invisible burden. They called him Eli. Some said he was strange. Others whispered behind their hands when they thought he couldn't hear them. They believed he was deaf, though none could say for sure. He rarely spoke, if at all, and when people tried to talk to him, his responses were often delayed or absent altogether. But little did they know, there was more to Eli than met the eye or ear. As the boy approached the small town of Blackwater Crossing, the first rays of twilight painted the horizon in hues of orange and purple. A cold wind swept through the streets, rattling the wooden signs above the saloon doors and sending tumbleweeds rolling past. The townsfolk gathered around the general store, their voices low and wary. There had been rumors lately, whispers of strange occurrences in the hills surrounding the town. Animals gone missing, eerie laughter echoing to the canyons late at night, and most disturbing of all, the disappearance of Sarah Mae Carter, the preacher's daughter. Sarah Mae had vanished without a trace 3 months ago. She'd gone out one morning to fetch water from the creek near her family's ranch and never returned. Search parties scoured the land, but all they found were footprints leading up to the edge of the ravine, and then stopping abruptly as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Her father, Reverend Carter, preached every Sunday about faith and hope, but his eyes betrayed the despair that gnawed at him day by day. Eli dismounted his horse outside the livery stable, tying the reins loosely to the post. As he walked toward the main street, the townsfolk turned their heads to watch him pass. Some nodded politely, while others exchanged uneasy glances. No one quite knew what to make of the boy who seemed so disconnected from the world around him. Yet, despite their curiosity, few dared approach him directly. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and the clinking of glasses. Men sat hunched over their drinks, their faces illuminated by flickering lamplight. At the far end of the room, Sheriff Hayes leaned against the bar, his arms crossed as he stared pensively into his whiskey. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a grizzled beard, his blue eyes sharp and observant. When Eli entered the saloon, the sheriff glanced up briefly before returning his attention to his drink. "Evening, boy," someone called out from a nearby table. It was Hank Johnson, the blacksmith, whose rough voice boomed across the room. "What brings you here tonight?" Eli didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood still for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Then, slowly, he made his way to an empty corner and sat down, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. On it were sketches, crude drawings of the ravine where Sarah Mae had disappeared. The townsfolk noticed the sketches and began murmuring among themselves. "What's this?" Hank asked, leaning closer to get a better look. "You think you saw something out there?" Still, Eli remained silent, offering only a slight nod. The tension in the room grew palpable as more people crowded around him, trying to decipher the meaning behind the cryptic drawings. Even Sheriff Hayes abandoned his drink and joined the group, his brow furrowed in concern. "Maybe we should send another search party," suggested one man, his voice tinged with unease. "There's something not right about that place." But the sheriff shook his head firmly. "We've already looked everywhere. If there's anything left out there, it ain't going to be easy finding it." Yet, deep down, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that the boy might hold some clue they hadn't considered. There was something about the way Eli handled himself, calm yet deliberate, that suggested he knew more than he let on. And so, after dismissing the crowd, the sheriff motioned for Eli to follow him outside. The night had grown darker now, the stars twinkling faintly above as the two of them stood beneath the eaves of the saloon. The sheriff lit a lantern, its soft glow illuminating their faces. "All right, boy," Hayes began, his tone measured but firm. "Tell me what you know, or show me if you prefer." For a moment, Eli hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the bench. Then, finally, he opened his mouth and spoke, not in his own voice, but in one that sent shivers down the sheriff's spine. "I'm buried alive." The words hung in the air like a curse, their weight pressing down on both men. Hayes staggered back, nearly dropping the lantern as he stared at the boy in disbelief. What did you say?" he stammered, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver at his hip. "It's me," the voice continued, smooth and haunting, yet unmistakably feminine. "Sarah May, I'm trapped." The sheriff's heart raced as he realized the truth. The boy wasn't deaf. He hadn't spoken because he wasn't speaking for himself. Somehow, somewhere along the line, Eli had become a vessel, a conduit for the spirit of the missing girl. Refusing to believe it, Hayes demanded answers. "How is this possible? Were you really?" "In the cave," came the reply, each word dripping with sorrow. "Under the roots of the old oak tree. Find me before it's too late." Before the sheriff could press further, the voice faded away, leaving Eli slumped forward, gasping as if waking from a nightmare. His eyes fluttered open, confused and wide with fear as he looked up at the stunned lawman. "What happened?" he croaked, his voice weak and trembling. Hayes knelt beside him, gripping the boy's shoulder tightly. "You told me where to find her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now we have to move fast." By dawn, a team of volunteers had assembled under the sheriff's command. Armed with picks and shovels, they set off toward the ravine, guided by Eli's sketches and the memory of the ghostly message. The journey was arduous, the path treacherous, but determination fueled their steps as they pushed forward into the unknown. When they reached the base of the ravine, they discovered the entrance to a hidden cave partially obscured by fallen branches and vines. Inside, the air was damp and musty, the walls lined with jagged rock formations that glittered faintly in the dim light of their lanterns. Deeper within, they uncovered the remnants of an ancient burial site, its existence long forgotten by time. And there, beneath the tangled roots of the massive oak tree, they unearthed a wooden box, its contents perfectly preserved despite the years. Within lay Sarah May Carter, her body untouched by decay, her expression serene as though she slept peacefully. Relief washed over the group as they carefully lifted her out, carrying her back to town with solemn reverence. Reverend Carter collapsed to his knees upon seeing his daughter restored to him, tears streaming down his face as he cradled her lifeless form in his arms. But the mystery didn't end there, for as the days passed, strange things began happening around Blackwater Crossing. Objects moved on their own, whispers echoed through empty rooms, and shadows darted across the walls even in broad daylight. Some claimed it was a lingering presence of those who had died unjustly. Others believed it was merely their imaginations playing tricks on them. Only Eli understood the truth. He alone heard the voices, the countless souls trapped between worlds, crying out for justice and peace. And though he feared them, he also felt compelled to help, knowing that until their stories were told and their wrongs avenged, the land would remain restless. Thus, the boy who once seemed deaf became the keeper of secrets, his silence replaced by the unspoken cries of the dead. In the Wild West, where legends were born and myths took root, Eli's tale became one that would haunt the hearts of many for generations to come. The days that followed the discovery of Sarah May's body were a whirlwind of emotions and unanswered questions. Reverend Carter held a solemn service in the small church at the heart of Blackwater Crossing, inviting everyone in town to pay their respects. The pews were filled with somber faces, each person carrying their own share of grief and bewilderment. Eli sat quietly in the back, his presence almost unnoticed among the crowd. But his mind was anything but still. He could feel it, the weight of the unseen pressing against him, urging him to listen. As the preacher spoke of faith and redemption, Eli's gaze drifted to the stained glass windows, their vibrant colors casting patterns on the wooden floor. But behind those colors, he saw something else, shadows moving where there should have been none. They flickered just out of sight, whispering words too soft for anyone else to hear, words that only he seemed capable of understanding. After the service, the townsfolk dispersed, some returning to their homes, others gathering in groups to discuss the strange events surrounding Sarah May's disappearance and reappearance. Sheriff Hayes lingered near the church steps, deep in thought. He had seen enough peculiarities in his years as a lawman to know that not everything made sense, but this case defied even the wildest explanations. Yet, one thing was clear. Eli was central to it all. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Hayes visited the boy at the small cabin where he lived alone, far from the prying eyes of the townsfolk. The structure was modest, its walls weathered by time and wind, surrounded by a sparse garden that barely survived the arid climate. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of pine wood and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. A single candle flickered on the table, casting long shadows across the room. "Don't lie," Hayes began, his voice low and steady. "There's more to your story than you've told me so far." The boy looked up from the book he had been pretending to read, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy between them. Then, slowly, Eli nodded. "I knew she was there," he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. "I've known since the day I first heard her." "Heard her?" Eli hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Voices, they come to me sometimes. Not always mine. Like echoes from somewhere else. She was one of them, telling me where she was buried, begging me to find her." Hayes leaned forward, gripping the edge of the chair. "And how many others have spoken to you, boy? How many voices do you carry inside you?" The question hung in the air, piercing through the quiet of the night. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together in his lap. "Too many," he whispered. "Some are angry, others are sad, and some, I don't even know who they are." The sheriff sighed, running a hand over his face. This wasn't a problem he could solve with a gun or a badge. It was beyond the scope of his experience. Yet he couldn't ignore the responsibility weighing on him. If what Eli said was true, and Hayes believed it was, then the boy wasn't just a witness to the supernatural. He was a conduit, a bridge between the living and the dead. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences continued to plague Blackwater Crossing. Cattle wandered off without explanation. Crops failed despite favorable weather, and an unseasonal chill settled over the land. Some blamed bad luck, while others spoke of curses laid upon the town. Reverend Carter delivered fiery sermons about sin and repentance, but even his fervent words couldn't quell the growing unease. One night, under the light of a full moon, Eli ventured into the hills alone. The whispers had grown louder lately, pulling him toward a place he hadn't dared explore before, a secluded canyon hidden behind a curtain of dense trees. The path was treacherous, the ground uneven beneath his boots, but he pressed on, driven by a force he couldn't explain. When he reached the canyon, he found himself standing before a crumbling stone altar, partially buried beneath layers of dirt and leaves. Carvings covered its surface, symbols that looked both ancient and alien. As Eli approached, the air around him grew colder, and the whispers coalesced into distinct voices, overlapping and clamoring for attention. "You must listen," one cried, desperate and raw. "Tell our stories," another demanded, its tone sharp and commanding. Eli fell to his knees, clutching his head as a cacophony threatened to overwhelm him. Tears streamed down his face as he struggled to focus, to separate the voices and make sense of their messages. Slowly, painstakingly, he pieced together fragments of their lives, names, dates, places, all buried along with their bodies in forgotten graves scattered across the land. By dawn, Eli returned to the town, exhausted but resolute. He sought out Sheriff Hayes once again, this time bringing with him a list of names and locations. Each entry corresponded to a voice he had heard, a soul crying out for justice and remembrance. Hayes listened intently, his initial skepticism giving way to awe as the evidence mounted. Together, they organized search parties, enlisting volunteers willing to brave the wilds in search of answers. One by one, they uncovered the remains of those whose deaths had gone unnoticed or unrecorded. Miners crushed in collapsed tunnels, travelers ambushed by bandits, children lost during storms. All had left behind traces of their existence, waiting patiently for someone to uncover the truth. With each discovery came a release, as though lifting a burden from the land itself. The whispers began to fade, replaced by a profound stillness that felt almost sacred. Yet, Eli knew better than to believe the ordeal was over. New voices would undoubtedly arise, drawn to him like moths to a flame, seeking solace through his unique gift or curse. Reverend Carter noticed a change in the boy, watching as Eli attended church services with renewed purpose. Though he still rarely spoke, there was a calmness about him now, a confidence born of accepting his role in the grand tapestry of life and death. During one particularly moving sermon, the preacher paused mid-sentence, staring directly at Eli as if addressing him personally. "Sometimes," he declared, his voice resonating throughout the sanctuary, "God calls us to bear burdens we cannot understand, to walk paths we did not choose. But in doing so, we become instruments of His will, bringing light to the darkest corners of existence." The congregation nodded in agreement, unaware of the depth of meaning behind the Reverend's words. Only Eli understood fully, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He was no longer merely a boy. He was a guardian of memory, a keeper of secrets whispered from beyond the veil. As the months turned into years, Eli's reputation spread beyond Blackwater Crossing, drawing people from distant lands seeking answers for their own lost loved ones. Some came bearing gifts, others offering gratitude, but all left changed by the encounter. And though the burden never lessened, Eli bore it willingly, knowing that in helping others, he also helped himself. For in the Wild West, where the line between life and death was often blurred, Eli proved that some mysteries were meant to be solved, not by guns or gold, but by courage, compassion, and an open heart. The years rolled on like the endless prairies of the West, stretching out before Eli in a sea of golden grass and crimson sunsets. His life had become a tapestry woven with threads of both light and shadow, each day bringing new challenges and revelations. The boy who once seemed deaf to the world now heard more than most could ever imagine. He moved through life as a silent sentinel, carrying the weight of countless stories that would otherwise remain buried forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Eli sat atop a hill overlooking Blackwater Crossing. The town had grown since those fateful days when Sarah May's voice first reached him from beyond the grave. New buildings stood where open fields once lay, and the population had swelled with settlers drawn by tales of prosperity and opportunity. Yet, amidst the growth, there remained an undercurrent of unease, a feeling that not all was as it seemed. It was during this time that whispers began circulating about a man named Silas Grimes. A former prospector turned rancher, Grimes owned vast tracts of land just outside the town limits. Known for his ruthless business tactics and volatile temper, he inspired fear in many and admiration in few. Stories told of how he'd driven away Native American tribes from their ancestral lands, destroyed rival operations, and amassed wealth through means both legal and questionable. Some claimed he carried a curse, a mark left upon him by the spirits of those he'd wronged. Eli felt the pull almost immediately. It started as a faint tugging sensation at the edges of his consciousness, growing stronger with each passing day until it became impossible to ignore. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered into the hills surrounding Grimes' property. The air was thick with tension, the moon casting eerie shadows across the rocky terrain. As he ventured deeper, the whispers returned, familiar yet different, filled with anger and despair. "You betrayed us," one voice cried, its tone laced with venom. "Your greed will consume you," another intoned, calm but chilling. Eli followed the voices, his heart pounding in rhythm with the haunting echoes. Eventually, he stumbled upon a hidden cave nestled within the mountainside. Its entrance was concealed by thick vegetation, revealing itself only when the wind shifted just right. Inside, the walls were lined with carvings similar to those he'd seen in the canyon months earlier. Symbols of unknown origin spiraled outward, forming patterns that seemed alive, pulsating faintly in the dim light of his lantern. At the center of the cavern lay a collection of artifacts, jewelry, tools, and fragments of pottery scattered haphazardly across the ground. Among them was a wooden box, its surface adorned with intricate designs. Eli approached cautiously, his fingers trembling as he opened it. Inside rested several bones, small and delicate, belonging to children whose lives had been cut tragically short. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. These were the remains of the very people Silas Grimes had displaced, their spirits crying out for justice long denied. But unlike previous encounters, these voices carried a darker edge, tinged with malice and vengeance. They spoke not of peace or remembrance, but of retribution. Over the following days, Eli observed Silas Grimes closely, watching as the man conducted his affairs with cold efficiency. Rumors abounded of disappearances linked to Grimes' operations, cowhands vanishing without explanation, neighbors reporting strange noises emanating from his estate late at night. Yet no one dared confront him directly, fearing retaliation or worse. Determined to uncover the truth, Eli devised a plan. Under the guise of seeking employment, he infiltrated Grimes' ranch, working tirelessly alongside the other hands while keeping a watchful eye on his surroundings. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. Beneath the main house lay a series of tunnels leading to a subterranean chamber, its walls lined with shelves containing jars filled with peculiar contents: locks of hair, shards of glass, even dried flowers. Each item bore a label bearing a name, date, and cryptic notation. Confronting Grimes directly proved perilous. When Eli attempted to question him about the discoveries, the rancher reacted violently, accusing the boy of meddling in matters best left alone. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Grimes snarled, his eyes wild with paranoia. "Some things are better left buried." But Eli refused to back down. Armed with evidence gathered during his investigation, he presented his findings to Sheriff Hayes, who reluctantly agreed to intervene. Together, they rallied a group of townsfolk willing to stand against Grimes' tyranny, storming the ranch under cover of darkness. What ensued was a battle not just of fists and firearms, but of wills and wits, pitting the living against forces far older and more powerful. In the end, Silas Grimes met his demise not at the hands of men, but at the mercy of the spirits he had so cruelly wronged. Their voices rose in unison, a symphony of fury and sorrow that shook the very foundations of the earth. The ground split open beneath Grimes' feet, swallowing him whole as the ghosts finally found their release. With the threat neutralized, the town breathed a collective sigh of relief. Yet Eli knew the work was far from over. For every secret uncovered, another lurked just beneath the surface, waiting patiently for the moment it would be revealed. And so, he continued his journey, walking the fine line between worlds, guided by whispers only he could hear. As the years passed, Eli's legend grew, spreading far beyond the confines of Blackwater Crossing. People spoke of him in hushed tones, calling him everything from a savior to a harbinger of doom. But to Eli, none of it mattered. He was neither hero nor villain, merely a vessel through which the past could speak to the present, ensuring that no story, no matter how painful or tragic, would ever be forgotten. And so, beneath the vast expanse of the wild west sky, Eli walked onward, his path illuminated by the stars above and the voices within.